A good nerve Shabbos, Chullin Daf Samach Vov. Yesterday we were discussing grasshoppers, and one of the grasshoppers that we were discussing was the elongated head grasshopper. It's machlokes whether or not he's kosher. What's the machlokes? Well, the Torah says that any grasshopper that has kra'im, meaning he has those two jumper feet that propels him into the air, is kosher. The way the Torah says it, asher loy kra'im, he has kra'im. But in fact, it's written with an aleph. Loy, he doesn't have kra'im. So what's going on here? Does he have to have kra'im? He doesn't have kra'im. Well, obviously the Torah means that he has kra'im. So why did the Torah write it with the aleph? Says the Gemara in yesterday's daf that the Torah is telling us that sometimes a grasshopper is so young he doesn't have the jumpers yet. Loy kra'im, he doesn't have kra'im. Nevertheless, he's kosher because he's from the species that eventually will have jumpers, and therefore today he's kosher. But the Gemara says that we're dealing here with a klal and prat, and maybe even a klal prat to klal according to the Vei Rabbi Shmuel. And that's the machlokes. When it says Asher Lo Kra'im, any grasshopper from all 800 grasshoppers that has two jumpers is kosher. So that's a very general statement. Then the Torah comes along and says, no, let me qualify that. Only 4 out of the 800. Arba, Solom, Chargol, and Chagov. 4. It's very, very specific. So that's a klal and a prat. And when I have a klal and a prat, I can't learn anything else. I can't have an elongated head guy. It's only those specific 4 and what's exactly like those specific 4. The Rabbi Shmuel says, and why don't the Vei Rav learn that there's a klal, prat, klal? In fact, that the Torah says liminehu, which should include a lot of other grasshoppers. They hold that when you have a klal or prat or klal, the second klal has to be very similar to the first klal. The first klal says jumpers, but the second klal says limineu. It's kind, which would mean that it has the 4 simonim that the Mishnah states, which are 4 legs, 4 wings, and that the wings cover most of its body, and then it has 2 jumpers. But that has nothing in common with the first klal. So therefore, they learned that it's not a klal or prat and klal, it's just a klal or prat. The Rei Shmuel say no. It doesn't matter that the last klal is not similar to the first one. It's still a klal or prat or klal. And in fact, this is the source to all of Shas that the Rei Shmuel hold that a klal or prat or klal, the first and last klal don't have to be similar. That's the machlokes, and therefore an elongated head grasshopper, according to the Rei Shmuel, is included in the klal or prat or klal. Now we're going to move on to fish, the kashrus of fish. The Mishnah says that in order for a fish to be kosher, it has to have 2 simonim, snapper v'kaskeses, fins, basically like wings that propel them through the water, and kaskeses, scales. Scales don't move, they don't have to move. Fins move to propel them through the water. What happens if a fish doesn't have scales today, but as he grows older, he'll develop scales, similar to the question we had by grasshoppers and their jumpers? Says the Gemara, that's perfectly fine. Meaning, what the Gemara is trying to say here is that you don't need to have scales in order to eat a fish. The scales just show us what type of fish we're dealing with. It's that species that's kosher. How do I know it's kosher? Because it has scales, but it doesn't have to have scales today. It's not like, say, the simana by a behema, they have a kanan and veshet. If you don't have a kanan and veshet, then obviously the behema is treif. No, this is just showing you what species it is. And therefore, says the Gemara, if you have a fish that as you take him out of the water, there's some sort of tuna, that as you take it out of the water, it loses its scales, it's also kosher, because there's a species that has scales. Now, there's a concept that any fish that has scales automatically has fins. But not necessarily if you have fins, you have scales. Therefore, if you see that a fish has scales, it's automatically kosher. You don't have to check for its fins. The obvious question is, then why does the Torah mention fins at all? All the Torah should say is, any fish that has scales is kosher. And we know that any fish that has scales has fins. And the answer is a very unique answer. It says that Goliath was wearing kaskasim. He's wearing an armor that looked like scales. So we know that scales means what we know today as scales, that kaskasim are scales. But nevertheless, there are people that might not know the Navi, so therefore the Torah elaborates. Water. Meaning, there's the ocean, and at the other scale, there's water and a kli. And we're talking about fish, kashrus of fish. And then there's 2 in between. So it goes Ocean is number one, the best of the best for fish, for kashrus of fish. Then goes mayon, it's water that comes out of the ground. Then you have a bar, or a cave, where it's rainwater gathered, but it doesn't come out of the ground, it just stays there. Worst of the worst is water that just sits in a kli, like a mikvah. And the Gemara tells us an amazing halacha, a halacha that not everybody knows, and just for this it's worth doing the daf. If one were to be in a mikvah, and he's very hungry, and along comes a juicy worm, or some sort of sheketz that was created in the water, and doesn't have a snapper v'kaskesses, you're allowed to eat it, because it's in a body of water that doesn't flow from the ground, and it's not a yam. Says the Gemara, not only that, not only in a mikvah, but even if the water is gathered in a pit, and it's connected to the ground. And how do I know that? Says the Gemara, there are two psukim that talk about the kashrus of fish. The one pasuk starts off saying that you're allowed to eat any fish that has snapper v'kaskesses, that has simanim. Then the second pasuk says that you're not allowed to eat fish that don't have snapper v'kaskesses. And they would seem redundant, because if I know that I have to have snapper v'kaskesses to eat fish, then obviously, if they don't have snapper v'kaskesses, it's asur to eat. The first pasuk says toichlu in the beginning of the pasuk, and at the end of the pasuk it says toichelu. Says the Gemara that the second pasuk helps us for the first pasuk, meaning that from the second pasuk I learn that any fish that's in the ocean has to have snapper v'kaskesses. However, if it's not in the ocean, if it's in a bar, if it's a pit, it was created in the pit, it does not need to have snapper v'kaskesses. It doesn't have to have the simonim. You're allowed to eat worms in the mikvah. And how do I know that in a bar as well? Because of that extra seichlu in the beginning of the pasuk. Now, just one other halacha. It seems like from the word toichelu, seichlu, I know that even an animal, that a sheketz that's in a body of water, such as a bar, that's like a kli, you're allowed to eat. The Gemara says, but wait a minute, I have a klalu prat here that could teach us the same exact thing, and I don't need the word toichlu. What's a klalu prat? It says bamayim once, and then right away, bamayim means all water in the world, and then it says bayamim, which means only the oceans. So it's very, very specific, only the oceans. And anything outside of the ocean, even in a mayon, even in a water that comes out of the ground, you should be able to eat shkatzim that don't have snapper v'kaskesses. So the Gemara, no, because we're dealing with a klal prat uklal, not a klal prat. And Memela, it tells us that you cannot eat from a mayon. Why is it a klal prat uklal? Because it says bamayim, bamayim, twice, that's two klals, and then afterwards it says bayamin. Well, wait a minute, it's not a klal prat uklal, it's a klal prat. Says the Gemara is the same thing. Anytime you have a klal uprat, you take the prat and you put it between the two klals and you come out with a klal prat uklal. Have a wonderful Shabbos. I will see you Be'ezer Hashem. Matzah Shabbos.